So, as we start on a new year, 2025, I'm starting on a new series of videos recounting the history of the Russian Revolution, as explained by one of its most important leaders, Leon Trotsky. Now, my previous videos were based on Volume 1 of Trotsky's history, The Overthrow of Tsarism. That volume concluded with the political victory of the Bolsheviks at the demonstration, which had been called by their opponents, in Petrograd on June the 18th, 1917, date taken according to the old Russian calendar. In this video, I'll make a start on Volume 2, The Attempted Counter-Revolution, which picks up the story from the end of June. And as Trotsky explains at the end of that first volume, by the end of its fourth month, the February Revolution had already exhausted itself politically. The compromisers, in other words the Menshevik and social revolutionary leaders, had lost the confidence of the soldiers and workers. A conflict between the leading Soviet parties and the Soviet masses now became inevitable. The Bolsheviks understood the mood of the active masses. They were right when they now understood that a demonstration was not enough, but a revolution was needed. However, the leadership knew that the right moment for insurrection was still far from reached. And as context to the caution that was correctly being applied by Trotsky, Lenin, and the other leading Bolsheviks, it's worth remembering the events of just 12 years previous to then, when the Moscow uprising that marked the end of the year-long 1905 Russian Revolution was crushed by troops mobilized from less revolutionary parts of Russia. And in this year, 2025, the 120th anniversary of that 1905 dress rehearsal of the 1917 Russian Revolution, it is worth going back over what the 1905 revolution achieved and what it failed to achieve. And there's a video that I've posted separately from a workshop I led at the Socialist Party's Socialism 2024 event that might help you to do just that. Because those lessons from just 12 years earlier must also have been fresh in Lenin and Trotsky's minds when they urged the impatient masses of Petrograd to draw back from their premature attempt of what was effectively at least a semi-insurrection in July 1917. And it is these events, now known as the July Days, that open Volume 2 of Trotsky's history. By July, the pace of revolutionary events in Russia had accelerated yet further. Back in May, the reformist Soviet leaders had taken their popular front position to its logical conclusion, accepting ministerial posts in a new coalition government alongside the capitalist parties. In June, that government had revealed its true nature by ordering soldiers onto the offensive at the front, an offensive that was already starting to collapse amidst retreats and desertions. The costs of the war were eating up more and more of Russia's limited national wealth. The value of the ruble was plummeting, while inflation rocketed. Strike action to demand wage increases to keep up with rising prices broke out here and there, but without any clear plan of action as to how to achieve its goals. Uncertain about the future, the bosses started to close down production. Metal output was cut by 40%, textiles by 20%. Rail transport was in total crisis, with the supply of food to the cities running short. The peasants were starting to seize the landlord's land without waiting any longer for the promised but continually postponed land reform legislation. The Menshevik and SR leaders like Tseretelli and Kerensky had no answers at all. They feared the workers and soldiers, who in turn, in Petrograd at least, looked on them with growing hatred. But the Soviet leaders also feared threats from the right. The capitalist Cadet Party leaders, even though supposedly in coalition with them, were openly discussing counter-revolution with the army commanders. Now, at the June the 18th demonstration, the Bolsheviks' demand of down with the 10-minister capitalists, in other words, let's have a workers' government, not a coalition one, had struck exactly the right tone and had won them ever-increasing support. Between April and June, the party had doubled its membership in Petrograd to over 32,000. It didn't yet have an overall majority in the city's Soviet, but it soon will have, amongst the workers' delegates at least. Because the Bolsheviks consistently sought to base their demands on a correct judgment of the changing consciousness of the workers and of the soldiers and peasants too. But of course, consciousness is never uniform. Consciousness in the country as a whole was still catching up with revolutionary Petrograd. It still lagged behind. They hadn't experienced the same level of struggle that Petrograd had been through. But that presented a problem. While Russia as a whole was certainly not yet ready for a socialist revolution, in Petrograd the workers, and in particular the soldiers who were faced with being sent to the front, were getting impatient. War and hunger continued, while the Soviet leaders that they had entrusted with their hopes seemed unable or unwilling to take action. As Trotsky puts it, even the more disciplined layers of workers, even broad circles of the party, were beginning to lose patience, or at least listen to those who had lost it. The demonstration of June the 18th had revealed to everybody that the government was without support. Why don't they get busy up there? The soldiers and workers would ask, having in mind not only the compromised leaders, but also the governing bodies of the Bolsheviks. And Trotsky adds, in general, the soldiers were more impatient than the workers, both because they were more directly threatened with a transfer to the front, and because it was much harder for them to understand considerations of political strategy. Moreover, each one had his own rifle, and ever since February, the soldier had been inclined to overestimate the independent power of a rifle. Soldiers' meetings, particularly of those regiments stationed in the industrial Vyborg district, such as the 1st Machine Gunners, were adopting resolutions demanding that firm action be taken against the government. Their determination sprang in part from those growing rumours that units from the Petrograd garrison were about to be sent to the front, but of course also from months of discussion and agitation from workers in this Bolshevik-dominated proletarian suburb. And the Bolsheviks had built close links with the 1st Machine Gun Regiment in the early days of the revolution, as they had also with an armoured car division who had taken over the abandoned palace of the court ballerina Sheshensaya early in March. They had gladly turned over the upper story of the building to the Petrograd Committee of the Bolsheviks. And the Keshinskaya Palace soon became the headquarters of the Bolshevik Central Committee and their military organisation too. From its balcony, speakers carried on what was in effect a continuous mass meeting by day and by night. Party meetings of one kind or another were always taking place somewhere in the building. But the Petrograd leaders viewed the impatient views of the Petrograd workers and soldiers with alarm. Trotsky explains, the danger was growing every minute that Petrograd, lacking the support of the front and the provinces, would be broken down bit by bit. On the 21st of June, Lenin appealed in Pravda to the Petrograd workers and soldiers to wait until events should bring over the heavy reserves to the side of Petrograd. He said, "We understand your bitterness. We understand the excitement of the Petersburg workers, but we say to them, comrades, an immediate attack would be inexpedient." However, despite the Bolsheviks' appeals, it was clear to all sides that the head of steam building up in Petrograd was heading for some kind of explosion. Meetings in the barracks were getting more and more heated. Resolutions were being adopted critical of the provisional government and demanding the transfer of power to the Soviets. The soldiers and workers were preparing to come out onto the streets of Petrograd to show their strength. Not that they'd arrived at any clear practical plan as to what their demonstration should try and achieve. They just knew that something had to change. They were ready to defend the revolution with their blood against any resistance from the bourgeoisie if necessary. But few would have said that their aim just then was an insurrection. No, their aim to them was quite simple. They just wanted to persuade the Soviet leaders to take charge of affairs. But the workers and soldiers had yet to learn that the attitude of the compromisers made this apparently straightforward wish far from simple. As Trotsky puts it, the July demonstrators wanted to turn over the power to the Soviets. But for this, the Soviets had to agree to take it. But he adds, these gentlemen of the democracy preferred a civil war when reaction sought to crush the revolution after the October victory. They preferred such a civil war against the people to a bloodless transfer of power into their own hands. Because in turning over the whole power to the bourgeoisie, these Democrats had continued to be somebody. But once they had power in their own hands, they would have become nothing at all. From the Democrats, the power would almost have automatically have slid into the hands of the Bolsheviks. So, on the surface, both those compromised leaders and the soldiers wanted the garrison to remain loyal to the Soviet Executive Committee. The soldiers thought that they were indeed being loyal to that EC in demanding power was put in the hands of the Soviets. But far from welcoming their actions, the EC wanted the soldiers to remain loyal to the compromisers' refusal to take the power and to maintain the rule of the possessing classes. This is why the Bolsheviks tried, at the very beginning of the July days, to persuade the soldiers to hold back, to explain that in these circumstances, as Trotsky put it, it is impossible to talk of a manifestation at this moment unless we want a new revolution. But this was a lesson that the Petrograd workers and soldiers were going to have to learn for themselves. The Bolsheviks were faced with a key strategic decision. Given the overall balance of forces, could they support the growing clamour for a mass demonstration? Now, to an ultra-left with no understanding of the careful considerations needed to lead a revolutionary struggle, the Bolsheviks' appeals for calm might be hard to understand. After all, the mood of the Petrograd garrison was such that a successful insurrection probably could have been organised in the city at that moment. And as Trotsky puts it, to shorten the birth pains of the proletarian revolution by 4 months would have been an immense gain. The Bolsheviks would have received the country in a less exhausted condition. The authority of the revolution in Europe would have been less undermined. But as Trotsky emphasised, nevertheless, the leadership of the party was completely right in not taking the road of armed insurrection. It is not enough to seize the power. You have to hold it. When in October, the Bolsheviks did decide that their hour had struck, the most difficult days came after the seizure of power. It requires the highest tension of forces of the working class to sustain the innumerable attacks of an enemy. In July, even the Petrograd workers did not yet possess that preparedness for infinite struggle. As events subsequently proved, an armed insurrection in July would not have been able to hold out. The workers and the soldiers under the leadership of the Bolsheviks would have conquered the power, but only to prepare the subsequent shipwreck of the revolution. The question of power on a national scale would not have been decided, as it was in February, by a victory in Petrograd alone. The provinces would not have caught up to the capital. The front would not have understood or accepted the revolution. The railroads and the telegraphs would have served the compromisers against the Bolsheviks. The government would have been able to send considerable masses of soldiers against Petrograd. The insurrection would have ended, in those circumstances, with the tragedy of the Petrograd Commune. And here, Trotsky is referring to the defeat of the heroic but isolated Paris Commune of 1871, where the workers of Paris briefly took power before being crushed. Even the Petrograd garrison was not yet sufficiently firm politically to take a determined revolutionary stand with Bolshevism, let alone the army as a whole. Without further experience of the compromisers' true intentions, the Soviet leaders would still be able to play the front and the provinces against Petrograd, arguing that the workers and soldiers in the capital didn't want to support the men in the trenches. Trotsky puts it like this: the state of the popular consciousness, decisive factor in a revolutionary policy, made impossible the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in July. At the same time, the offensive on the front impelled the party to oppose the demonstration. The collapse of the offensive was absolutely inevitable. As a fact, it had already begun, but the country didn't yet know it. The danger was that if the party were incautious, the government might lay the blame upon the Bolsheviks for the consequences of its own madness. The offensive had to be given time to exhaust itself. Trotsky summarizes: the masses take part in events, however, not at the bidding of doctrinaires, but at whatever time this flows inevitably from their own political development. The Bolshevik leadership understood that only a new revolution could change the political situation, but the workers and soldiers did not yet understand this. Okay, so in many ways I've given you the analysis before the history of the events itself. But let's explain how the July days eventually developed. And the spark that set these events off came not from below, but from above. Aware of the impending news of the total collapse of the offensive at the front, the cadets decided it would suit them best to withdraw their 4 ministers from the government. Milyakov, the cadet leader, hoped that this would leave the compromisers to face the music alone, and, so weakened, to open the way to counter-revolution. Trotsky says the rumour of the resignation of the cadets immediately spread through the capital and generalised all the existing conflicts politically in one slogan, or rather one cry to heaven: let us have an end of this coalition rigmarole. On the morning of July the 3rd, several thousand machine gunners, after breaking up a meeting of the company and regimental committees of their regiment, elected a chair of their own and demanded immediate consideration of the question of an armed manifestation. Now, the Bolshevik chair of that meeting had tried without success to urge for more reflection. The party then spent speaker after speaker, including the popular and respected Nevsky, leader of the military organisation of the Bolsheviks, to appeal to the machine gunners to hold back. The soldiers listened, wavered for a while, but then finally resolved that they were going to take to the streets. And having made a decision, the machine gunners set to work to build support for an armed demonstration, armed both to protect the crowds and to show their strength to the enemy. Cars armed with the machine guns were sent out ready to protect the route of the march. Delegates went to the factories and other regiments to appeal for support. Most took little persuasion. The longest debate actually took place at the huge Putilov factory, where 10,000 men assembled to listen to the delegation from the machine gunners. Trotsky recounts how, to shouts of encouragement, the machine gunners told how they had received an order to go to the front on the 4th of July, but they had decided to go not to the German front, against the German proletariat, but against their own capitalist ministers. The secretary of the factory committee, a Bolshevik, objected, suggesting that they ask instructions from the party. Protests from all sides. Down with it. Again you want to postpone things. We can't live this way any longer. The worker Bolsheviks, unable to do anything further to restrain their colleagues, knew they had to go with them to the demonstration. Because the masses had no intention of breaking with the Soviet. On the contrary, they wanted the Soviet to seize the power. Still less did the masses intend to break with the Bolshevik party. But they did feel that the party was irresolute. They wanted to get their shoulder under it, shake a fist at the executive committee, give the Bolsheviks a little shove. Now, anarchist voices weren't slow to encourage the soldiers, and in all probability, government provocateurs and secret police also joined in. Many of the rank and file Bolsheviks, to be honest, were also pleased at last the prospect of action, and they had no wish to argue for the official party policy of patience. The workers and soldiers remembered, after all, that the Bolsheviks, under the previous leadership, had been too indecisive in February and March, that the 8-hour day had been won by action from below, that in April Milyukov had been thrown out after the soldiers had taken to the streets under their own initiative. So why should they listen to the Bolshevik leadership now? Trotsky puts it that the anarchists, in summoning the masses to battle, referred to the fact that the February Revolution also took place without the leadership of a party. But the February Revolution had its prepared tasks laid down by the struggle of whole generations, and above the February Revolution stood an oppositional liberal society and a patriotic democracy ready to receive the power. The July movement, on the contrary, would have had to lay down a whole new historic roadbed. The whole of bourgeois society, the Soviet democracy included, were implacably hostile to it. This basic difference between the conditions of a bourgeois and a workers' revolution, the anarchists did not see or did not understand. But Trotsky explains the events that then unfolded. By 7 o'clock, the industrial life of the capital was at a complete standstill. Factory after factory came out, lined up and armed its detachment of the Red Guard. Samsonevsky Prospect, the chief artery of the Vyborg side, was packed full of people. To the right and left of it stood solid columns of workers. In the middle of the prospect marched the machine gun regiment, the spinal column of the procession. At the head of each company went an automobile truck with its Maxims machine guns. After the machine gun regiment came the workers. Covering the manifestation as a rear guard came detachments of the Moscow regiment. Over every detachment streamed a banner, "All power to the Soviets." The funeral procession in March and the 1st of May demonstration were probably more numerous, but the July procession was incomparably more eager, more threatening. Under the red banners marched only workers and soldiers. The cockades of the officials, the The shiny buttons of the students, the hats of lady sympathisers were not to be seen. All that belonged to 4 months ago, to February. Automobiles flew through the streets in all directions, full of armed workers and soldiers. By 9 o'clock, 7 regiments were already moving towards the Tauride Palace. They were joined on their way by columns from the factories and by new military detachments. The movement of the machine gun regiment developed a colossal power of contagion. The July days had begun.